Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to see everyone online today. We have a great program in store for you this afternoon. My name is Megan Sullivan, and I am a PhD candidate at the Yale School of the Environment, and I'm also the Research Spotlight Assistant for the Peabody Museum. I'm welcoming you to our Research Spotlight series. This series highlights different researchers who conduct their studies in connection with the museum's collections at the Yale Peabody Museum. I'd like to point out just a few of the Zoom webinar features that you can use before we start our talk today. Just a note that we have disabled the chat function for this webinar, so please use the Q&A box to submit any questions that you have. And you can submit questions at any time during the webinar. So if you think of something during the presentation, please put that question in the Q&A box, and we will be collecting those questions and compiling a list to ask in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. We typically do receive many more questions than our presenters have time to answer, so we apologize in advance if we're not able to get to your specific question today. And finally, our program is being live captioned. You can turn on the captioning in the menu, which is usually at the bottom bar of your Zoom screen on the right side. So with that, I would like to introduce today's speaker. We have Advait Jukar joining us, and Advait is the lecturer of paleontology at the University of Arizona. He is also a curatorial affiliate at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History and a research associate in paleobiology at the Smithsonian Institution. Advait's research spans 150 million years and several continents. Much of his work has focused on the systematics, paleoecology, and evolutionary dynamics of mammals in South Asia. He's also conducted studies on fossil mammals in North America and on the ecology of Jurassic dinosaurs from the American West. His talk today will focus on a remarkable collection of fossils from the Indian Subcontinent from a Yale collecting expedition in 1932. So with that, please welcome Advait Jukar.
Thanks, Megan. It's really good to be here, and it's great to be back at the Peabody, a museum that is very dear to my heart. So like Megan said, I'm the lecturer of paleontology at the University of Arizona. But prior to coming here, I was a Donnelly postdoc at Yale, and I worked in the Peabody on this collection that I'm going to be talking to you about. I'm mostly a vertebrate paleontologist, but I also dabble in the history of science. So this talk is going to be sort of a mix of the history of science and of some paleontology. Go ahead and share my screen. All right. So today I'm going to talk to y'all about Shiva's ape and Brahma's beast. It's the story of a paleontology collection at the Peabody, which was collected by a young Yale graduate student named G. Edward Lewis from then British India. When you think about paleontology at Yale, which actually has a long history and legacy of paleontology, the images that might be conjured up are the images of, Othniel Charles Marsh, who was the great professor of paleontology. But Yale actually has a long history of research in the Indian subcontinent as well. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge a few people. Dan Brinkman, who had co-authored a study on this collection with me, and Vanessa Rue, Sam Murphy, Sue Hushcraft, and Patrick Sweeney, without whose help this research would not have been possible. So the early expeditions from Yale were conducted by people like O.C. Marsh. This is a famous image from the Yale College Scientific Expedition of 1872 to the American West, where O.C. Marsh went out with Yale undergraduate students to collect fossils. And this is typically what you might think of when you think of Yale paleontology. Other things that might come up are the great bone-bearing beds of Coma Bluff in Wyoming. These are two images that were painted by Arthur Lakes in 1877 of the bones that are coming out of these Jurassic rocks. And many of these fossils were on display in the Great Hall at the Peabody, and are present in the collections and will be on display once again when the Peabody opens up in early 2024. You also think about animals like Hesperornis, which is a toothed bird that was described by Othniel Charles Marsh. These odontornithes or toothed birds are famous because it was used back in the day as one of the direct lines of evidence for Darwin's theory of evolution, and interestingly got Marsh in trouble with the federal government, who didn't quite believe that research on these birds was worthy of funding. Marsh also collected horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, which are at Yale. And Yale also has a significant collection of fossil mammals from the American West, including Uintatherium anceps. This animal belongs to an enigmatic group of large herbivores from the beginning of the age of mammals in the Cenozoic. And interestingly, these animals were the catalyst for the bone wars between O.C. Marsh and Edward Grinker Cope. These two paleontologists wanted to name as many species as they could, and so they went out to the Bridger Badlands of the American West and started to find these strange fanged herbivores and kept on naming new species, even though they all essentially belonged to just a handful. But Yale has this collection of fossils from India, and you would not expect this at the Peabody, which has a long tradition of paleontology from the American West. So why is it that Yale has this collection from South Asia? And this is the story that I'm going to be talking about today. So these collections that are at the Peabody were collected in the 1930s. In the time period between about 1820, 1830 through the early 1900s was the age of exploration. It was also the age of imperialism and age of colonialism. Museums were set up across Europe and North America, and paleontologists were dispatched out to the far corners of the earth to collect fossils, which would then go and fill the halls. During the expansion out west in North America, museums from the American East and from Chicago sent collectors out. So here's a picture of Harold Menke in 1900 at a quarry in Colorado, laying next to the humerus of the giant dinosaur Brachiosaurus altithorax. It wasn't just in the American West that people were making these discoveries. A famous example of international discoveries by American paleontologists comes from the American Museum of Natural History's Central Asiatic expeditions to the Gobi Desert in the early 1920s and 30s. These were undertaken by Roy Chapman Andrews, who went out there and found evidence of dinosaur eggs. This was the first time that we had a good understanding of the ontogeny or development and reproductive behavior of dinosaurs. It wasn't just in Asia. The German paleontologists went out into German East Africa, now Tanzania, where a miner working for the Lindy Prospecting Company came across a huge cache of giant dinosaur bones, which are now on display at the museum in Berlin. And these include charismatic animals like Giraffatitan bronchi, one of the largest dinosaurs to ever live. But this was all taking place in the early 1900s. About 70 years before that, in the Indian subcontinent, British explorers started to find fossils. And this is where our story really starts, in British India. So here's a map of British India in 1837. The pink parts of this map are the parts that were controlled by the East India Company, which was a private corporation that ended up trading and then colonizing large parts of the Indian subcontinent. Officers of the company and other naturalists who would come into the Indian subcontinent at this time started to make significant discoveries of fossils. The first ones were made in Burma, followed by fossil collections from the Zanda Plain on the Tibetan Plateau, and then a huge collection of fossil mammals from the Sivalik Hills just south of the Himalayas. And then, of course, there were concurrent explorations in central India, where mammals from the latest part of the Pleistocene were collected, and mammals from the western Indian state of Gujarat dating to the Miocene. But the most significant collection of fossil mammals from South Asia were made in the Siwalik Hills in the 1830s. This is a range of hills which runs just south of the main Himalayan mountain belt, and they consist of deposits that were laid down by ancient rivers. And the animals which lived on these floodplains died there and were preserved in vast fossil deposits. The first fossils there were found by Hugh Falconer and Proby Cotley, two officers of the East India Company, who were out there building irrigation canals. And Falconer and Cotley, along with other officers from the East India Company, were prospecting out there as amateur naturalists and paleontologists and found an immense collection of bones. To some accounts, they would go out and find about 600 specimens in a given day. One of the most famous discoveries that Falconer and Cotley made was this giant giraffe called Civaterium giganteum, which was a giant antlered giraffe that lived in the Indian subcontinent at the time. This was about the same sort of shape as an okapi, but with large moose-like antlers coming out of its head. In the old Orientalist traditions of their day, Falconer and Cotley decided to name these animals after Hindu gods. And so Civaterium means Shiva's beast. And this tradition continued on in Indian paleontology into the works of G. Edward Lewis. This fossil collection was so significant that Falconer and Cotley were awarded the Wollaston Medal by the Geological Society of London. This was the highest honor that was given by the society, and other members like Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace were also awarded this medal, along with Charles Lyell, one of the founders of modern geology. And this medal was awarded to them for their research on the geology of India, and more particularly for the discovery of many fossil remains of extinct quadrupeds at the southern foot of the Himalayan mountains. And this discovery was so significant that Charles Murchison, who was Falconer's biographer, noted that by the joint labors of Falconer, Cotley, Baker, and Durand, a subtropical mammalian fossil fauna was brought to light, unexampled for the richness and extent in any other region than known. So South Asia has been producing these massive quantities of fossils for hundreds of years, and they've largely been forgotten. But over time, Yale has played a significant role in research on these South Asian faunas. Subsequent to Falconer and Cotley, collecting efforts were taken up by the officers of the newly formed Geological Survey of India, which was based in Calcutta. And all of those fossils then went to live in the Indian Museum in Calcutta, where they reside today. In the early 1920s, American paleontologists started to come into the Indian subcontinent, largely to make representative faunal collections from these areas, which had previously been studied by European paleontologists. Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History sent Barton Brown, who was more well known for the discovery of Tyrannosaurus rex and dinosaurs in North America than for fossil mammals in South Asia, but he made the largest collection of fossil mammals from South Asia, which is currently housed at an American museum. And the motivation was that American students of mammalian evolution will now be able to gain a comprehensive understanding of the upper tertiary faunas of India without the necessity of a long trip to London or Calcutta, which is where most of the fossils were previously kept. So here's a picture of Barton Brown in his pith helmet in a stream bed in India, with a couple of his local collectors chipping away at the skull of a large elephant that they had found in a boulder concretion. Following the Barton Brown expedition, Helmut de Terra, who was then a research fellow and professor at Yale, wanted to go back out to the Himalayas, not primarily to collect fossils, but to go and study the geology of the Himalayas in relation to the uplift of the mountains and the dispersal of people around the Asian continent. This expedition was led by G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who was a professor of biology and ecology at Yale, and incidentally, the founding father of the modern field of ecology. Hutchinson went out there to make the biological collections and was interested in studying the lake faunas in the Indian subcontinent. Daytera's main goal, again, was to go and find evidence of early humans and document human cultures there. But he had known about these fossil deposits in the Indian subcontinent. And so he led this expedition out there in 1932, which included a couple of surveyors from British India, Khan Sahib Afrazul Khan and A.M.N. Ghosh, who was a geological collector. He took with him G. Edward Lewis, who was a young graduate student at Yale and at the Peabody. And Lewis's task was to go and make the paleontological collections there. So here's Lewis in the field near the town of Haratal Younger in India, again, wearing a pith helmet and shorts and field boots with a marsh pick and a brush, which are still tools that paleontologists use today. This is a hand-drawn map that Daytera sketched out, which plotted where the expeditions would go. So Lewis was dispatched out to the Potwar Plateau in Pakistan, where people like Pilgrim and officers from the Geological Survey of India and Barn Brown after them had made their collections. While Daytera and Hutchinson went north into the Kashmir Valley and then explored parts of the Himalayas there. Here's an image of the expedition in Srinagar in 1932. So from left to right, you've got G. Edward Lewis there in a suit looking quite sharp, followed by Helba Daytera and his wife, Mrs. Daytera. There's the surveyor, Afzal Khan. And down there, who's seated, is G. Evelyn Hutchinson. So the expedition kind of met back up in Srinagar in Kashmir about May of 1932. They got to British India in March of 1932. So Lewis was dispatched out to the Potwar Plateau in Pakistan, and he explored the formations around the towns of Chinji, Tokpatan, and Taprok, which are quite fossiliferous. He came back up to Kashmir when Daytera sent out a dispatch for him in May. And then after failing to find fossils up in the Kashmir basin, went down to India to prospect near the towns of Haratal Younger and Chandigarh, and then went back out to the Potwar Plateau, after which he came back to the United States. These were some of the landscapes that Lewis probably prospected. And this is the Chinji Formation on the Potwar Plateau in Pakistan, which includes a lot of sandstones, which are chock-a-block full of fossils. And here is Lewis once again in the field. We actually know quite a bit about Lewis's field experiences because he kept detailed notes in 2 field journals. These are notebooks 1 and 2, where he kept notes about the exact places where he found the fossils, the conditions on the ground, and his experiences with the local people there and with his fellow expedition colleagues. So here are a couple of extracts from the notebooks that I thought were particularly interesting. So here in notebook 1 on the 21st of March, 1932, he talks about the conditions out there that he was dealing with. He says that the flies and mosquitoes are getting pretty terrible. Daytera did not give me a net, and one really can't get up every 5 minutes or so during the night to fill the air with flit, which is an insecticide. The caravan arrived in due time after 2 of the camels had fallen down and smashed 2 cases, more or less. The one I have repaired. The other is the tin food truck. It looks like a compressed concertina, but I hope to draw it out. So this gives us a sense of the kinds of conditions that Lewis was in when he was out there prospecting for fossils on the Potwar Plateau. Much of the food had to be transported on camelback or on horseback in these tin cases. The terrain was fairly rough, and so these pack animals oftentimes fell down, and oftentimes their equipment was lost. There were a lot of bugs out there, which is oftentimes what we find in field expeditions today as well. He also talks about the actual process of extracting fossils from the hills. And here he's talking about a large skull of an extinct elephant called Paratetralophodon. I'll show you all pictures of that in just a minute. He talks about how it took 6 men to carry 2 of the tusks into Naragi, and that they were all pooped by the time they had traveled half the way, and they had to get, and then he had to get some more men to leave them. So it just talks about the actual manual labor involved in the field expeditions in British India at this time, where he was out there without any trucks, without any winches, trying to hire locals to help him move these large fossil collections from his field sites, oftentimes a distance of a couple of miles to the nearest town, where they could be packed up in a lorry or put on camelback and then taken out of there. One of the most significant things that Lewis did is that he actually took his fossils and plotted them on maps that he took with him. So when Lewis went out to the field, he took a series of maps that were drawn up by the Survey of India at the time. And unlike his predecessors in Indian paleontology, people like Falconer and Cotley and officers from the Geological Survey of India, he marked on the maps where he found these fossils, which makes his collection probably one of the most useful collections of Indian fossils of its time. For any modern paleontological analysis, it is imperative that we know where the fossils come from in space, because then we can go and map them in time. And when we know where these fossils come from in time, we can start to ask questions about the evolution of these animals and their ecology and how this has changed through time. So here's one of the maps that Lewis took out with him, which is currently housed in the archives of the Peabody. It shows the area around the town of Naragi, where this large elephant skull came from. It's from locality number 15, just south of the Soane River there. And as you can see here on this inset, there are lots of places where he's actually marked out where these fossils came from, and he kept comprehensive lists of which fossils came from here. And what we managed to do with these maps is digitize them and then upload those into a GIS package, and then come up with modern day maps and coordinates for each of these sites. Since then, people have gone and done some systematic mapping and dating of these sediments. And because we know now where Lewis collecting localities were, we can start to get better ages on them, which makes them way more useful than some of these earlier collections that Falconer and Cotley made. So let's talk a bit about the fossils that Lewis collected. Here's an early selfie from Lewis in the field, where he's standing with this large skull of Paratetralophodon down here, covered in plaster. And he's broken off 2 of the tusks and he's covered them in plaster as well. This is from locality 15 here. It's probably one of the earliest selfies in paleontology, and you can see the shadow of his tripod and camera just up on the ridge as he's taking this photograph. And this specimen is actually preserved in the collections at Peabody. The whole skull is still needs to be prepped, but part of the snout, which bore the tusks and the tusks, which Lewis brought back with the help of 6 men, have been prepped out and are available for study. And this is what this animal would have looked like in real life. It would be a fairly large elephant with 4 tusks, about the size of a modern African elephant or slightly larger than that. Lewis also discovered the remains of a new species of pig called Hippohyas dayteri. And it's always amused me that he named this pig after Helma daytera, because Lewis had a slightly difficult relationship with the organizer of the expedition. Daytera, of course, didn't give him his mosquito nets. He sent the collecting permit quite late, so Lewis had to deal with a lot of red tape and bureaucracy when he got to the ground on the Potor Plateau. And just in the middle of collecting, Deterra summoned Lewis up to Kashmir, which was a 5-day drive from the Potor Plateau, but Lewis didn't have any motor vehicles to get him there. So he was quite annoyed at the way Deterra was treating him. So when he came back to Yale and he started to go through his collection, he described a new species of very, very small pig after Helmut Deterra. And so this pig, Hippohyus, is quite small, and you can actually hold this skull in the palm of your hand. He made significant collections of fossil reptiles as well. Here's a skull of a fossil gharial from the collection, Gavialis lewisii, which was named in Lewis's honor, and Panchura tatrotia, which is a pond turtle from the Savalics. And of course, here is Brahma's beast. This is Brahmatherium megacephalum, which is a large giraffe that was found by Lewis in the Savalics. This is a particularly strange animal. It's kind of like that Cebatherium that I showed you all, with large ossicones coming out from his head. It was short-necked like an okapi, but quite large in size. And keeping with the tradition of Savalic paleontology, Lewis named this Brahmatherium, or Brahma's beast. But probably most significantly, Lewis made a significant and sizable collection of fossil primates. Prior to this, there were only a handful of fossil primates known from the Savalics, and this was from the efforts of Falconer and Cotley and later Guy Pilgrim. But Lewis made a collection of several new kinds of fossil primates from the Savalics, including taxa named Brahmapithecus, Sugrivapithecus, and Sivapithecus. And of course, these are called God's apes because Brahma, Sugriva, and Shiva are all in the Hindu pantheon. And so Lewis kept up with this Orientalist tradition of naming these specimens after local deities, which I think was quite progressive for him in his day. These are significant because we start to get an understanding of early primate evolution from these specimens. Primate fossils in general are quite rare. These are not large specimens. They largely fit in the palm of your hand. So this is my hand with one of the jaws of Sivapithecus there. And this is what a reconstruction of those apes would have looked like. These apes are significant and important because they actually spurred quite a bit of research in the Savalics after Lewis. These apes, for the longest time, were thought to be the earliest members of the hominins, which is the lineage of primates that we come from. And it spurred further expeditions in the Savalic Hills by Yale's scientists through the Yale North India expedition of 1935, where they recovered additional fossil specimens. The Yale Punjab University expeditions of the 1960s, led by Yale professor Elwyn Simons and SRK Chopra of Punjab University, and most significantly, the Yale and now Harvard Geological Survey of Pakistan expeditions of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Probably the longest expeditions in the Savalic Hills of their time, led by Elwyn Simons' PhD student, David Pilbeam. And what they did is that they went and discovered way more specimens of fossil mammals in the Savalics, and they led to quite a bit of exploration in the hills that led to the systematic mapping and dating of these rocks. So what about these god apes? Initially, Lewis thought that they belonged to the line of primates that led to us. But later studies have shown that they actually belong to the line that includes orangutans, so they're pangolins, rather than animals like chimpanzees or Homo. Which is also quite interesting because it goes to show that there were quite a few of these early apes in the Savalics at this time. But this research in the Savalics led to the collection of thousands of new fossils there by teams from the UK, from the US, from Germany, from India and Pakistan, which has now led to a more comprehensive understanding of the fossil faunas from that region. We now know the exact stratigraphic positions of many of these species, which has allowed researchers to understand how climate change has led to the evolution, extinction, and immigration of new kinds of fossil mammals in the region. We can now see that these earlier apes, like Sivapithecus and Ramapithecus, go extinct during a period of climate change when these symbolic ecosystems start to become more arid, and new species like grazers start to come into the system. And this systematic research, inspired by these collections from Yale, has also led to quite a bit of research on fossil deposits in India, which has been the focus of my work. And so because of this work and these new dating efforts in the Indian subcontinent, I've managed to synthesize these records and shown that these faunal changes that were quite well known in the older part of the record are now quite well known in the younger part of the record as well. And we can use these to understand faunal change in the youngest part of the records in the Indian subcontinent, which are linked to the megafaunal extinction. The collections from Lewis's collection have helped me study equivalent fossil deposits in Western India in collaboration with researchers from Punjab University as well. And so now we're studying similar fossil deposits from the southern arm of the Savalik group. But what about Lewis's collections now? I've talked quite a bit about how subsequent researchers have improved on these fossils. But because Lewis's collections were largely known for the fossil primates, much of the other fauna, and there are about 1,200 specimens which are housed at the Peabody, have gone unstudied since. And so over the last few years, I've undertaken a study to go and systematically reassess this fauna and place them in a chronostratigraphic sequence to start to understand faunal change in the Indian subcontinent using this collection, and then try and link it to the kinds of environmental changes that we're seeing in the present. Specimen-based research like the kind that I'm doing here is particularly important because this collection is essentially a storehouse of biodiversity. It's biodiversity of the past in the Indian subcontinent, a part of the world that is being critically understudied. Much of what we know about mammal ecology and evolution comes from fossil mammal deposits from North America and to some degree from Europe and from Africa. But South Asia, with this incredible wealth of fossil mammal remains, has largely been ignored by paleontology. And so one of my goals is to shed light on this record and to try and highlight the fossil wealth from the Indian subcontinent. So I'm going to leave you all with this picture of Lewis's selfie from the hills, and a selfie that I took about 90 years after Lewis's expedition with the exact same specimen currently in the Peabody. And so it's sort of a nice continuity from Lewis to me, and how these fossils have impacted so many different paleontologists and have shown that these collections at Peabody at Yale can have a very significant impact on the science of paleontology and on our understanding of the ecology and evolution of mammals in South Asia. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. We had a couple of really interesting questions that came in while you were giving your presentation. And so I'm just going to jump right into those. Our first question comes from Lav, and they say that this is a fascinating account Advait, thank you. In your work, have you also come across Indian writings or responses on the subject, or discoveries at the time? This is when you were talking about kind of the historical context of these expeditions that you're finding in the Peabody collections. And this person is also asking, what was the circulation of knowledge amongst Indians at that time? And was that through institutions such as the Calcutta University then?
Right, those are excellent questions, and it's something that I've been trying to explore over the last few years as well. Paleontology doesn't seem to be an Indian science for the most part. There are early accounts of fossil discoveries in India, but they're largely from people building. But they're largely from people building canals in the hills in the 1300s and them finding fossils. Fossils were also used by local Indians in their trade. There's a fascinating account of an Indian washerman using the tooth of an elephant as a rock that he used to wash his clothes on. That was then acquired by one of these British officers and now is in the museum in Calcutta.
Wow.
Yeah. And so
talk about creative use, right?
Right. I mean, it's a large flat tooth, and they just kind of used it to beat their
right. I mean, it's the perfect sort of object for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. But in terms of knowledge amongst Indians in British India, paleontology was largely kept to Europeans. There were a handful of Indians who were trained in paleontology after World War II. And I think this was largely because there was a lack of manpower, actually after World War I. And this was because there was a lack of manpower of young European men who were going to the colonies to participate in the geological survey. So the survey started to train Indians like D.N. Wadia and a couple of other Indians who participated in the paleontological process. For the large part, they were geological collectors. They were sent out with people like Pilgrim to go and collect from these hills. In terms of the circulation of knowledge, that seems to mostly take place post-independence. There are a few collectors who are known from pre-independence times, but they don't seem to provide a lot of scholarship in paleontology as much as the Europeans do. The ones who do end up publishing are the ones who go abroad.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you so much. There's another question from Mena who says, are any of these expeditions responsible for our learning about the Deccan traps and their possible relationship to the KT extinction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And our studies on the Deccan trap are actually quite young in relation to all of this. Much of early Indian paleontology had focused on fossil mammals. There were some dinosaur discoveries at the time in central India, but much of our understanding of Deccan volcanism has come about in the last 30, 40 years.
Okay, gotcha. And then this question is from Stephen. Do we have definitively referable mandibles of Paratetralophodon hasnotensis to assert that it was a four-tusked gomphothere?
Right. So Paratetralophodon hasnotensis is that big skull that Lewis took his selfie, but actually features quite prominently in his notebooks, because I think eventually it took 16 men to haul it off that hill.
Wow.
And take it down, and they had to do it in shifts. It just took a lot of elbow grease to get it off there.
Right.
But we don't have any definitive mandibles from this animal as far as I know. The reconstruction that I used was based off of other kinds of tetralophodons, which are known from Eurasia. We don't quite know what was going on with this one species in South Asia.
Okay, gotcha. A question from Say Chen is, any plan that Lewis's journals would be published if they have not yet been?
So you can actually access those journals at the archives at the Peabody. You can find,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So all of this
That's really
material
cool.
is available at the Peabody for scholars to come in and work on. In fact, my good friend Amelia Bonea, who's a historian of science, who very kindly indulges my sort of forays into the field, was at Yale working with me on the Lewis collection and was in the archives trying to understand these early expeditions and their relationship to the later work by Elwyn Simons and other colleagues in India. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in this, contact the Peabody and I'm sure they can get you access.
Okay, great. That is wonderful. And then Melissa had a question. Why was the focus on primate material? Was it because of a greater curiosity of early human evolution?
Yeah, so the initial interest wasn't even paleontology. It was just, Tara wanted to go out there and look at the mountains and see how people had dispersed through. But it was only when Lewis made these collections of fossil primates, largely in India from localities near the town of Haradil Younger, that paleontologists started to get more interested. And it's because back in the 1920s or so, there was this old idea that hominins may have evolved in Asia. And this was prior to Raymond Dart's discovery of hominins in South Africa. I think at that time, Darwin was the only one who had posited that humans may have evolved in Africa. Everyone else sort of had this Eurocentric model of human evolution. And that's why these teeth became so interesting to a lot of paleoanthropologists subsequently. Lewis also in his dissertation said that there were some structures in the teeth and in the shape of the jaw that may have that indicated that they were early hominins, which meant that they were in our line. So I think that's where this interest came about. I think we've always been interested in our origins, and this was just one of the pieces of that puzzle.
Cool. Great. I just wanted to read one kind of interesting comment from a audience member here named Mike. They say, great presentation, brings memories of when I was a student at Yale under Hutchinson and Simmons. So yeah. And then I wanted to ask this question from Shyam. It says that farmers must have come across fossils long ago. Do we know what people thought of them in Indian countrysides? By maybe when they came across them by mistake, did they think that they were known animals, like supernatural, you know what I mean? What was their thoughts on these things? Yeah.
So we have a handful of reports from Falconer, interestingly, on how local people had conceptualized fossils, and from the people who were trading fossils from the Tibetan plateau. So on the Tibetan plateau, they were called lightning bones. And they were thought that they were produced when lightning struck the rocks, and they were oftentimes sold across the plateau into India as either charms or trinkets. These bones were commonly used in Chinese medicine as dragon bones, or they were ground up in traditional Chinese medicine. In India, what we understand is that the local people considered them as relics of the gods. So in one of Falconer's accounts, he says that one of the locals absconded with one of their fossils and took it to the local king, saying that it was the head of a god. And so it's possible that was their conceptualization. We don't have any records that local Indians at the time have thought about these as remains of past animals.
Okay.
Have mythologized in a sense.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, we are almost out of time here. We have so many great questions. Like I said, we're just not able to get to all of them, but we had a huge audience today. And so.
If you want, we can take a couple more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, So there's a question from Chris here that says, how have most of these early localities been reinvestigated since the early days, for example, Markanda, or just the large productive ones like Potoir?
Yeah, so the Potoir Plateau has been extensively mapped and surveyed by David Pilbeam's group. They've been doing it for like the last 40 years, and it's probably what needs to be done across the Symbolics. On the Indian side, there needs to be more systematic work. People have gone back to the Markanda and they found new fossils. Most of these are housed in the Symbolic Fossil Park, which is a local fossil park and museum in the valley there. But no one has actually gone and systematically, gone and relocated these early collections. Most likely because they don't map them out. I've spent years and years trying to figure out if there's any evidence of Falconer's localities, but even Falconer back in the 1850s was lamenting on how when these fossils were taken from the hills and kept at the Asiatic Society in Bengal in Calcutta, the labels all kind of evaporated there. They evaporated. So he laments about the poor state of localities even in the 1850s. So it's going to be hard to go and find those exact spots again.
Great. And then we have one question from Lynn, who asks, will some of the fossils you mentioned be on exhibit when the Peabody reopens? And if so, do you know which ones?
Yep. So the Brahmatherium, Brahma's beast, the big strange rhino, will be on display in the new Peabody, I think, in the foyer. So y'all can go see a symbolic specimen out there.
Excellent.
Quite big, it's about like 3 feet tall.
Great. And everybody will be able to look forward to that opening after they've learned some of the interesting information that you've been able to give us in that historical context in this talk. So thank you so much. I think we should probably wrap it up here. Like I said, so many great questions. I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming today. We had a wonderful turnout for this presentation. I want to thank you, Advait, for just putting together this wonderful presentation of both history and current science that is being done with these collections at the Peabody. It's so great to get all of that contextual information so that when we're in the museum and we see these things, we have a little bit of the background history in our heads. I want to plug just the next talk that we're going to focus on in our Research Spotlight series. This is going to highlight work from Elise Parker. The talk will be taking place in early December, and she will be telling us about how fish biodiversity is generated in the Antarctic. In the meantime, you can sign up for the Peabody mailing list or follow our channels on social media so that you're aware of all the webinars, online and in person, now programming that is occurring at the Peabody. And we just want to make sure that you all can join in to all of the events and programs that you want. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Yeah, and thanks.
Thanks so much.